Yesterday morning, Trump announced that JD Vance was flying to Pakistan for a second round of peace talks with Iran. Yesterday afternoon, the USS Spruance fired a 5-inch cannon into the engine room of an Iranian cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman, and U.S. Marines boarded and seized it. Both of those things happened on the same day, 12 hours apart. Iran's response was immediate. Its foreign ministry announced it has no plans for a new round of talks. Iran's Joint Military Command warned that its armed forces will soon respond and retaliate against what it called armed piracy by the U.S. military. Iran's president called Pakistan's prime minister and told him Washington's behavior proves it intends to betray diplomacy, the same way it betrayed diplomacy before the February 28th strikes that started this war. Vance is on his way to Islamabad right now. The hotel security perimeter is set up. The Pakistani mediation team is ready.
And Iran has told the world it is not coming. The ceasefire expires in 48 hours. This is not a negotiation teetering on the edge. This is a negotiation that was shot in the engine room on the same day it was supposed to resume. And what the mainstream coverage is missing, what every outlet is framing as a simple escalation, is the strategic logic inside that contradiction. Because Trump did not fire on the Tuska by accident, and Iran did not walk away from the table without calculating exactly what walking away does to the clock. By the end of this video, you will understand what actually happened in the Gulf of Oman yesterday, why Iran's decision to pull out of Islamabad is not a tantrum, but a deliberate strategic move, what the 48-hour clock actually means for oil markets, global shipping, and every country that imports Gulf energy, and whether there is any path between here and Wednesday that does not end with the guns restarting. If this channel is where you come when you need to understand what is actually happening beneath the headline, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The next 48 hours will move faster than any news cycle can track. You need to be positioned ahead of it. Let's establish the precise timeline, because the sequence of events on Sunday tells a story that the individual headlines do not. Saturday, April 18th. Iran fires on commercial vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. UK Maritime Trade Operations confirms one incident. India's foreign ministry summoned Iran's ambassador after what it described as a serious incident of firing on merchant ships involving 2 Indian-flagged vessels. Iran's foreign minister had declared the strait open on Friday. The IRGC declared it closed again on Saturday. The foreign minister and the IRGC gave the world opposite answers on the same day, which tells you something about who is actually making decisions about the strait from the Iranian side. Sunday morning, April 19th, Trump posts on Truth Social that Iran decided to fire bullets yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz, a total violation of our ceasefire agreement. He announces that his representatives are traveling to Islamabad for negotiations. He posts, "No more Mr. Nice Guy," and threatens to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran if a deal isn't reached. In the same post, he invites Iran to take a very fair and reasonable deal. Sunday afternoon, April 19th, the Iranian-flagged cargo ship Tuska, 900 feet long, nearly as heavy as an aircraft carrier bound from Malaysia heading to Bandar Abbas, Iran, attempts to transit through the U.S. naval blockade zone in the Gulf of Oman. U.S. Central Command says the USS Spruance issued repeated warnings to the Tuska over a 6-hour period. The Tuska's crew did not comply. The Spruance fired several rounds from its 5-inch MK gun into the Tuska's engine room after warning the crew to evacuate that compartment. U.S. Marines boarded and seized the vessel. Trump announced it on Truth Social. Our Navy ship stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a hole in the engine room. It was the first ship fired upon and the first ship seized since the blockade went into effect 1 week ago. Sunday evening, oil jumped more than 6%. West Texas Intermediate futures surged above $89 a barrel. Brent crude climbed nearly 6% to above $95. U.S. stock futures fell. No tankers passed through the Strait of Hormuz for the entirety of Sunday, one of the quietest days in the channel since the conflict began on February 28th. Sunday night into Monday morning, Iran's foreign ministry announced it has no plans regarding a new round of talks. Iran's Joint Military Command issued a formal warning of retaliation. Iran's president called Pakistan's prime minister and used the word betray, accusing the U.S. of the same pattern of diplomatic betrayal that preceded the February 28th strikes. Iranian state media reports began suggesting the talks might not happen before the U.S. even confirmed Vance was en route. Monday, April 20th. Vance departed for Islamabad. Iran had still not confirmed participation. The ceasefire expires Wednesday. That is the full sequence. The U.S. fired on an Iranian ship and simultaneously sent its vice president to negotiate with the country whose ship it just fired on. Iran walked away from the negotiating table and simultaneously warned of military retaliation. Both sides are doing two contradictory things at once, and the clock has 48 hours left. The mainstream coverage is treating the Tuska seizure as an escalation that complicated the talks. That framing misses the strategic logic. Trump did not fire on the Tuska despite announcing peace talks. He fired on the Tuska as part of the pressure architecture that is supposed to produce a deal. Here is how that logic works from Washington's perspective. The U.S. blockade has been in effect for 1 week. In that week, CENTCOM says it turned back 23 ships heading to Iranian ports. The blockade is costing Iran, by Trump's own estimate, $500 million a day in lost commerce. But a blockade that only turns ships around is a blockade that can be tested. The Tuska was a test, an Iranian-flagged vessel attempting to run the line, presumably with the knowledge or tolerance of Iranian authorities, to see how the U.S. would respond. The response was designed to be unambiguous. 6 hours of warnings, then a cannon round into the engine room, then Marines on the deck. The message to Iran: the blockade is not a suggestion. It has hard consequences. Every Iranian ship that attempts to transit it will be stopped, disabled if necessary, and seized. The seizure is coercive diplomacy at its most literal. Fire on a ship on the same day you announce peace talks, so that Iran's negotiators arrive at the table having just watched their own vessel boarded by U.S. Marines. Trump said the blockade was costing Iran $500 million a day, while the U.S. loses nothing. That cost asymmetry is the strategic foundation of Washington's negotiating position. The longer the blockade holds, the more it costs Iran, and the less it costs the U.S., at least from Washington's perspective. The Tuska seizure was meant to demonstrate that the blockade will hold regardless of Iranian attempts to probe it. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf made the Iranian counter-logic explicit on state television. It is impossible for others to pass through the Strait of Hormuz while we cannot. That sentence is the Iranian mirror image of Trump's blockade logic. The U.S. is blocking Iranian ships. Iran is blocking everyone else's ships through the strait. Both sides are imposing maritime restrictions simultaneously and telling the other side that the restrictions will continue until their own terms are met. The Tuska was the moment those two parallel blockade logics collided physically. And when they collided, Iran decided the collision was reason enough not to come to the table. Iran's decision to pull out of the Islamabad talks is not emotional. It is calculated. Here is the calculation. Iran's president told Pakistan's prime minister that U.S. actions prove Washington intends to betray diplomacy. The same pattern as before. That is a specific historical reference. The February 28th strikes happened while Iranian and American officials were in active indirect nuclear negotiations through Oman. Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, had said good progress was being made just days before the bombs fell. Iran's negotiating team was at the table when US B-2s were already in the air. From Iran's perspective, the pattern is the U.S. engages in talks while simultaneously preparing or executing military escalation. The Tuska seizure, on the same day as the Islamabad announcement, fits that pattern precisely. Iran's leadership made a decision, before the second round of talks even began, that showing up to Islamabad 48 hours after the U.S. seized an Iranian ship would signal that Iran accepts military pressure as compatible with diplomatic engagement. That is a signal Iran is not willing to send. There is also a domestic political dimension. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, installed after his father was assassinated on February 28th, has pledged revenge and promised his military command total obedience. The IRGC, which controls the strait and controls the naval forces that were present when the Tuska was seized, has vowed retaliation. If the Iranian government sends its delegation to Islamabad the morning after the IRGC vowed retaliation for the Tuska, the civilian government is publicly overriding the military command. In Iranian political culture, where the supreme leader and the IRGC hold paramount authority over elected officials, that sequence is not domestically sustainable. The pullout is Iran's way of synchronizing its diplomatic posture with its military posture. You cannot have the foreign minister flying to Islamabad for talks, while the Joint Military Command is simultaneously warning of armed retaliation for piracy. Iran resolved that contradiction by canceling the foreign minister's trip. But, and this is the detail that keeps the 48-hour window alive, Iranian sources told CNN that a delegation representing Tehran will also be traveling to Pakistan for talks, though Iranian state media has not confirmed it. The foreign ministry says no plans. Unnamed Iranian officials tell CNN a delegation is coming. That gap between official Iranian public communication and what Iran's negotiators are actually doing is the only diplomatic space that remains between now and Wednesday. Pakistan's mediation team is in Islamabad. The security perimeter around the Serena Hotel is set. The rooms are booked. If Iran arrives quietly, without confirming publicly, maintaining the posture that it walked away while simultaneously sending negotiators, the talks happen. That kind of deliberate ambiguity is not unusual in negotiations where both sides need to maintain domestic audiences that want to see the other side held accountable. The question is whether the Tosca seizure made that ambiguity too difficult to sustain. Mid-script, subscribe prompt, 13 wounds. If this analysis is giving you a clearer picture than what you're finding in the breaking news coverage, subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this with one person who is watching the ceasefire clock without understanding the strategic logic driving every move on both sides. Here is the framing inversion that changes how you read Iran's pullout from Islamabad. The mainstream narrative is Iran walked away from talks because it was provoked by the Tosca seizure. The U.S. miscalculated by firing on the ship. The talks are now in jeopardy because of an American escalation. That framing makes Iran a reactor, a country that responds emotionally to provocations and walks away from its own interests when pushed. It is not how Iran's foreign policy establishment operates. Here is the alternative read. Iran was never going to accept the terms on the table in Islamabad regardless of the Tosca. The first Islamabad session failed after 21 hours on the same issues that divide the two sides today. Enrichment duration, Hormuz sovereignty, sanctions relief, reparations. Washington proposed a 20-year pause on Iranian enrichment. Iran rejected that and offered 5 years. That gap, 15 years, did not close in Islamabad, and nothing that has happened in the weeks since has moved either side's position on it. What has changed in the last week is the military and economic pressure environment. The blockade went live. Iran closed the strait again. The Tosca was seized. Oil jumped above $95. India summoned Iran's ambassador. The global economy is absorbing its 50th consecutive day of Hormuz disruption. The IMF warned that global growth will take a hit even if the ceasefire holds. Iran pulling out of talks now, publicly, with a formal statement from the foreign ministry and a military retaliation warning from the Joint Command, does something specific. It puts the responsibility for the 48-hour countdown entirely on the United States. If the ceasefire expires Wednesday and the guns restart, Iran's public record shows that it was the U.S. that fired on an Iranian ship, the U.S. that violated the ceasefire first, the U.S. that sent a negotiating team to a meeting the other side refused to attend. Iran is constructing a narrative in which any resumption of hostilities is Washington's fault, not Tehran's. That narrative matters for three audiences simultaneously. It matters for the domestic Iranian audience, a population that has absorbed over 1,200 civilian deaths, 3.2 million displaced, and a $300 billion to $1 trillion hit to its economy, according to the Iranian government's own assessment. A government that negotiates under the barrel of a gun it just watched fired at its own ship has a legitimacy problem at home. Walking away maintains the posture that Iran does not negotiate under coercion. It matters for the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, who are watching both sides and recalculating their own positions daily. The Gulf is divided. Some want Iran permanently weakened, others favor diplomatic outcomes, and some remain genuinely ambivalent. Iran's pullout, framed as a response to American military provocation, gives the pro-diplomacy Gulf states a reason to press Washington harder for a deal on terms Iran can accept. And it matters for China. Beijing is Iran's largest oil customer. China has been pushing Iran toward the ceasefire because a closed Hormuz disrupts Chinese energy supply. But China also cannot be seen to be pressuring Iran into accepting terms it publicly described as capitulation. Iran walking away from talks after an American military action gives China a clean narrative. The U.S. escalated, Iran responded, Beijing tried to maintain stability, and Washington made it impossible. Iran is not walking away because it is losing. Iran is walking away because, with 48 hours left on the clock, the cost of showing up to Islamabad under current conditions is higher than the cost of not showing up. That calculation changes if the U.S. offers something concrete before Wednesday, or if the Gulf states, China, and Pakistan collectively pressure Washington to pull back the Tosca seizure and offer a gesture that gives Iran's leadership something to show its domestic audience. Rory Johnston, founder of Commodity Context, told CNBC yesterday, We had the most violent day in the Strait on Saturday that we've had since the beginning of this crisis, and things don't seem to be getting any better. That assessment from one of the most closely tracked energy analysts in the world is the market's read on where the 48-hour clock is heading. Wednesday is not an abstraction. It is the specific moment at which the ceasefire that has kept this war at a pause, however imperfect, however violated, however fragile, officially expires. Here is what each of the three roads to Wednesday actually looks like from where we are right now. Road 1. Iran arrives in Islamabad. A framework emerges. This road requires Iran to do something it just publicly said it will not do. That is not impossible. Diplomatic history is full of governments that officially refused talks and then quietly sent delegations. Iranian sources told CNN a delegation may be coming. Pakistan's foreign minister is still working the phones. China's influence on Tehran, applied through back channels rather than public statements, remains the most plausible mechanism for getting Iran back to the table. If Iran arrives, the issues that blocked a deal in the first Islamabad session are still on the table. Washington proposed 20 years of enrichment suspension. Iran offered 5. The honest midpoint is somewhere between those numbers, but reaching it requires Washington to publicly accept that Iran retains some nuclear program, something Trump has repeatedly said he will not accept. If a formula exists that both sides can describe as a win at home, it lives in the gap between zero enrichment and complete sovereign right to enrich, something like a verified pause of defined duration with phased sanctions relief and IAEA access. That formula has not been publicly proposed by either side. The energy markets read on this road. Analysts quoted in CNBC said that even if the Strait opens, oil prices would see an immediate drop of $10 to $20 per barrel before stabilizing in the 80s to 90s range, reflecting ongoing scarcity from the 500 million barrels of crude already knocked out of the global market. More than 20,000 seafarers have been stranded on hundreds of ships in the Gulf since February. Getting them home and restoring supply takes weeks, not hours, regardless of when the ceasefire becomes permanent. Road 2. The ceasefire expires without a deal, but without immediate military resumption. Both sides let Wednesday pass without a deal, but neither side immediately launches strikes. Iran keeps the strait closed under its permanent mechanism framing. The U.S. keeps the blockade active. The conflict freezes at its current level of mutual maritime restriction. Talks continue at lower intensity through back channels. Pakistan maintains its mediation role. A new deadline emerges, 30 days, 45 days, 60 days. This road is the most likely outcome based on historical precedent. Both sides have more to gain from an extended stalemate than from the certain costs of renewed full-scale hostilities. Iran's economy is damaged, but the regime is intact. U.S. military costs are at $18 billion and climbing toward a $200 billion additional authorization. Neither side wants to explain a renewed bombing campaign to its domestic audience. But this road has its own risk, a frozen conflict in a waterway with an unclear mine situation, an active U.S. naval blockade, Iranian patrol boats, and Indian, French, and British ships being fired on is not a frozen conflict in a stable condition. It is a frozen conflict in a volatile waterway where an incident, another ship seizure, an IRGC patrol boat in the wrong place, a miscalculated intercept, restarts the shooting without any political decision being made by either side's leadership. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told CNN on Sunday that U.S. gas prices, now averaging $4.05 a gallon nationally, may not return below $3 until next year, not next month. Next year. That is the Energy Secretary's own assessment of the minimum timeline for economic recovery, even in the best-case scenario. Every additional week of frozen conflict extends that timeline. Road 3. The ceasefire expires and the guns restart. The IRGC's Joint Military Command said this morning that Iran will soon respond and retaliate for the Tuska seizure. Trump said that if Iran rejects the deal, I would certainly expect the fighting to resume. He has threatened to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. Iran has the capacity to execute threats of its own, the Houthis, Iraqi militia networks, and whatever ordnance remains in the strait. Road 3 is not the most likely outcome for Wednesday, but it is the road that, if it happens, produces consequences that no actor in this conflict is positioned to manage. More than 500 million barrels of crude have already been knocked out of the global market. the largest energy supply disruption in modern history, according to Kepler data. A resumed conflict adds to that figure daily, at a cost that the IMF, the World Bank, and every major investment bank have already started quantifying in terms of global growth points and inflation percentage points. Alan Ayer, a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute and former member of the U.S. team that negotiated the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, said it plainly: until and unless the U.S. negotiating team rids itself of the misconception that military victory equals strategic dominance, we're not going to get to a solution. That assessment is the most honest summary of the gap between where Vance is flying to and where Iran is refusing to go. 48 hours. That is what stands between the current fragile pause and the expiration of the ceasefire that has kept the guns at a simmer for 2 weeks. In the last 24 hours, the United States fired on an Iranian ship and sent its vice president to negotiate peace with the country whose ship it just fired on. Iran responded by walking away from the table and warning of military retaliation. Both things are simultaneously true, simultaneously active, and both are heading toward the same 48-hour deadline. Oil is above $90 and climbing. No tankers moved through the Strait of Hormuz on Sunday. Gas prices in the United States hit $4.05 a gallon, and the energy secretary just said they won't return below $3 until next year at the earliest. More than 20,000 seafarers are stranded on hundreds of ships waiting for a waterway that may never reopen on the terms either side is currently willing to accept. Vance is in the air toward Islamabad. The Pakistanis are ready. Iran has officially said it is not coming, but Iranian sources told CNN a delegation may still arrive. The next 48 hours do not determine who wins or loses this war. They determine whether this war continues as a military conflict or gets frozen into something that costs the global economy more slowly and less visibly, but just as persistently. Both outcomes are bad. The question is which one Washington and Tehran choose when the clock runs out on Wednesday. Leave your assessment in the comments. Not a reaction, a strategic read. Does Iran send a delegation to Islamabad quietly, despite what it said publicly? Does a framework emerge in 48 hours on a deal that neither side could close in 21 hours 10 days ago? And if the ceasefire expires with no deal and no extension, which side moves first and what does it look like? If this gave you the full picture behind the headline, share it with one person who needs it. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't, stay sharp, stay ahead. The next update is already being built.